A dusty Saturday afternoon in Dawson County, Nebraska. October. The air tasted like dry corn husks and impending rain. Miller, the manager of the local John Deere dealership, stood at the edge of a field. His Italian leather boots were ruined. $500 of fine calfskin, now caked in black, stinking gumbo mud. But the boots weren't his problem. The 8R was. $150,000 of green paint, silicon chips, and hydraulic pride. It sat motionless, a wounded dinosaur. The pride of the dealership buried up to the axle housing in a death pocket, a hidden spring that had turned the field into a trap. The tires were 6 feet tall. They weren't turning. The computer had seen to that. 3 hours earlier, Miller had been laughing. He'd been leaning against the 8R's pristine hood, mocking a man named Earl. Earl was 70, maybe 80. It was hard to tell. His skin looked like an old baseball glove. He drove a 1954 Farmall, a rusted skeleton of a tractor. It leaked oil. It smelled of burnt diesel and old memories. Earl had stopped by to buy a $5 filter. Miller had pointed at the Farmall. He'd told Earl to move that piece of junk before it contaminated the showroom floor. He'd called it a relic, a paperweight. He'd told Earl that the world had moved on to machines for real farmers. Now, the real machine was sinking. 2 heavy-duty tow trucks sat idling on the gravel road. Their operators were shaking their heads. They'd already snapped a 2-inch steel cable. It had whipped through the air with a crack like a .45 caliber pistol, shattering a truck's windshield. The 8R didn't budge. It wasn't just stuck. It was anchored. The engineers were there too, young men, clean fingernails. They held iPads like shields. They tapped screens. They ran diagnostics. "The drivetrain is locked, sir," one of them said. His voice was thin. The AI detected excessive torque resistance. Safe mode. It's a fail-safe to protect the $40,000 transmission. We can't bypass it without a factory override code from the home office. Miller didn't care about codes. He cared about the sun. It was dropping. The clouds were bruising, purple, heavy. If it rained tonight, that $150,000 rig would stay in that field until spring. His career would stay there with it. Then the sound. Pop, 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 pop. The rhythmic, uneven heartbeat of a 4-cylinder gasoline engine. The Farmall was back. Earl was at the wheel. He stopped at the edge of the muck. He didn't get down. He just sat there. His hands, scarred and grease-stained, rested loosely on the steering wheel. He looked at the green giant buried in the mud. Then he looked at Miller. Silence. Weaponized silence. Miller broke first. He had to. $10,000, Earl, Miller shouted. His voice was ragged. "You get that thing out. I'll write you a check for $10,000 right now." Earl didn't blink. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a pouch of Red Man tobacco. He took his time. He tucked a wad into his cheek. He spat a dark stream into the dust. "I don't want your money, Miller," Earl said. His voice was like gravel rubbing together. "Your money is as useless as that computer in your lap right now." Miller stepped forward. He forgot about his boots. He sank to his ankles. "Then what?" "Name it. Anything." Earl reached into the bib of his overalls. He pulled out a piece of paper. It was a standard contract, typed up on an old Smith Corona. "The trade school," Earl said. "In town. They're teaching kids on engines from the 70s. They need something new. They need a challenge." He pointed a calloused finger at the buried 8R. "If my junk pulls your future out of that hole, you sign the title over to the school. A donation. Tax deductible, but it leaves your lot forever." The engineers laughed. It was a nervous, high-pitched sound. "That's impossible," one said. "That Farmall weighs 3,000 pounds. The JD weighs 30,000. Plus the suction of the mud? It's physics. You'd snap that old tractor in half." Earl didn't look at the engineer. He didn't acknowledge his existence. He kept his eyes on Miller. "The rain is coming, Miller," Earl said. "In about 20 minutes, once the topsoil turns to grease, you won't get a helicopter to lift that thing out. Miller looked at the clouds. He looked at the iPads. He looked at the sinking green hood. His hand trembled. He took a pen from his pocket. He signed. "Do it," Miller hissed. Earl nodded once. A short, sharp movement. He climbed down from the Farmall. He didn't rush. He moved with the economy of a man who knew exactly how much energy he had left in his bones. He walked to the back of his tractor. He unrolled a chain. It wasn't a standard tow chain. It was dull, matte black. It looked heavy enough to anchor a destroyer. Earl waded into the mud. He didn't complain. He didn't grunt. He reached under the 8R's massive frame. He knew where the steel was strongest. He didn't need a manual. He'd spent 40 years as a master mechanic in the Army's Heavy Recovery Division. He'd pulled tanks out of the Mekong Delta. This was just a tractor. He hooked the chain. He walked back to the Farmall. "Get back," Earl said. The engineers retreated. Miller stood his ground, crossing his arms, a sneer fighting to return to his face. He wanted Earl to fail. He needed Earl to fail. Because if Earl succeeded, Miller's world, the world of brochures and high-tech specs and easy commissions, was a lie. Earl settled into the iron seat. He didn't rev the engine. He didn't scream. He reached down and adjusted a lever that wasn't factory standard. The lever was hand-forged, crude, effective. Deep inside the Farmall's belly, something was different. Earl had spent 3 years in his barn after he retired. He didn't play golf. He didn't watch the news. He worked with a lathe and a welder. He had replaced the stock transmission with a custom-engineered reduction gear set salvaged from an M4 Sherman tank recovery vehicle. It wasn't built for the highway. It was built for the impossible. The engineers moved closer. One of them, a man in a crisp polo shirt with a degree from MIT, pointed at the Farmall's rear tires. They were old. The rubber was cracked. "The friction coefficient isn't there," the engineer whispered. "He's going to dig a hole and bury himself in 5 seconds. It's basic statics." Earl didn't hear him, or he didn't care. He eased the clutch out. He didn't stomp on the gas. He didn't make the engine scream. He just let the friction plate bite. The chain groaned. It didn't just tighten. It sang. A low-pitched, vibrating hum that made the teeth of the men standing on the gravel road ache. The matte black links began to stretch. The water trapped in the mud around the JD was squeezed out by the sheer tension. The Farmall didn't move, not at first. The engine note changed. It went from a rhythmic pop to a deep guttural growl, a sound of raw, unbridled labor. Clack, a sound from the JD, the sound of high-tech plastics and safety pins being tested to their absolute limit. "He's going to rip the frame off," Miller shouted. He looked like he wanted to stop it, but his feet were frozen in the muck. Earl didn't look back. He leaned forward. His eyes were fixed on a single rock 10 feet ahead. He wasn't pulling a tractor. He was winning a war. Then it happened. 1 inch. The JD's front left tire, buried 3 feet deep, shifted. A bubble of swamp gas escaped the mud with a wet, disgusting burp. The engineers stopped breathing. The Farmall's rear tires didn't spin. They clawed. Earl had weighted the rims with 1,200 pounds of calcium chloride. The old rubber gripped the hard pan beneath the silt like a mountain lion's claws. Another inch. The Farmall's front wheels lifted 6 inches off the ground. Earl didn't panic. He didn't hit the brakes. He just shifted his weight, keeping the balance perfect. A tightrope walker on a tractor. The JD was moving. It wasn't a fast exit. It was a slow, agonizing crawl. It was the sound of $150,000 of German-engineered perfection being dragged, kicking and screaming by a machine that belonged in a scrap heap. "Impossible," the MIT engineer muttered. He looked at his iPad. The screen showed a critical system failure alert for the JD. The computer still thought it was stuck. It was wrong. Earl reached for a second lever, the auxiliary low. The Farmall's engine didn't even flinch. It took the load. It welcomed it. 10 minutes. That's how long it took. 10 minutes of the most intense mechanical violence Dawson County had ever seen. The JD finally crested the lip of the death pocket. It rolled onto the firmer soil. Earl didn't stop. He kept pulling. He pulled the green giant all the way to the gravel road 20 yards past the danger zone. He stopped the Farmall. He set the brake. He didn't jump off and cheer. He didn't pump his fist. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his rag, and wiped a single drop of oil from the steering column. The silence that followed was heavier than the tractor. Miller was shaking. His hands were deep in his pockets. He looked at the 8R. It was covered in filth. A sensor was hanging by a wire. The safe mode light was still blinking on the dashboard, a bright, mocking amber. The engineers were huddled together. They looked like they had just seen a ghost. Earl climbed down. He walked to the back of the JD. He unhooked his black chain. He coiled it slowly, methodically.
He walked over to Miller.
The manager didn't look up. He was staring at his ruined boots. "The title," Earl said. Miller looked at the paper in his hand. The ink was smeared. "Earl, look, this was a demonstration, a misunderstanding. The company, they'll fire me. I have a mortgage. I have a kid at Lincoln." Earl didn't move. He didn't soften. "You had a mouth too," Earl said. 3 hours ago. You used it to tell me my life's work was garbage. You used it to tell me I didn't belong in your world." Earl took a step closer. The smell of diesel and hard work rolled off him. "Now you're going to use it to call the school." Miller's bottom lip trembled. He looked at the crowd. There were 20 people there now. Neighbors, other farmers, people Miller had tried to upsell for years. They all had their phones out. They were recording. There was no way out. Miller signed the secondary transfer document. His hand was shaking so badly the signature looked like a jagged scar. "Get it out of here," Miller whispered. "I won't," Earl said. "And the school will. Monday morning. They'll bring their own trailer. They'll take it apart. They'll see how the future works, and they'll see why it failed." Earl turned his back on Miller. He walked to his Farmall. Pop, 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 pop. The old red tractor roared back to life. Earl didn't look back. He drove away, heading toward his small farm on the north side of the county. He left the $150,000 rig sitting on the side of the road like a discarded toy. The rain started then, big, cold drops. They hit the JD's hood, washing away the first layer of mud. Miller stood in the rain, alone. The engineers had already retreated to their climate-controlled SUV. He looked at the gravel road. He looked at the tracks left by the Farmall. They were deep. They were permanent. He realized then that you can buy horsepower, you can buy AI, you can buy leather seats and GPS guidance, but you can't buy the dirt under a man's fingernails. And you damn sure can't buy the respect of a man who's been pulling the world out of the mud since before you were born. Monday morning arrived with the sound of air brakes. It wasn't a school bus. It was a 40-foot lowboy trailer pulled by a Peterbilt that had seen 1,000,000 miles of Nebraska highway. Behind it followed a convoy of pickup trucks. Old Fords, dented Chevys. The students of the Dawson County Vocational School had arrived. Miller was there. He hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot. His expensive suit was replaced by a windbreaker that looked too big for him. He stood by the glass doors of the dealership, watching the dismantling of his ego. The dean of the school, a man named Henderson with hands as rough as Earl's, walked up to the JD-8R. He didn't look at the GPS dome. He didn't marvel at the leather interior. He looked at the mud-caked axles and the matte black chain still resting on the bumper. "We got the call from Earl," Henderson said. He didn't thank Miller. He didn't shake his hand. He just handed him a clipboard. "The transfer papers are already processed through the state board. It's a vocational asset now." Miller's voice was a whisper. "It's a $150,000 machine. You're going to let 18-year-olds touch it?" Henderson looked at Miller, a long, slow look. "No. We're going to let 18-year-olds understand why it failed. We're going to strip the sensors. We're going to map the software lockout. And then we're going to teach them how to build something that doesn't quit when the ground gets soft. He turned to his students. Load it up. The students didn't use a computer to move it. They used a winch, a heavy mechanical grease-covered winch. The JD was dragged onto the trailer like a captured beast. Inside the dealership, the phone rang. It was the area vice president from Moline, Illinois. Miller picked it up. He didn't say hello. Miller? The voice on the other end was cold, professional. We've seen the videos. 2 million views on Facebook. 3 million on TikTok. A 1954 Farmall pulling our flagship 8R out of a hole while our own software locked the wheels. Sir, the mud isn't the problem, Miller. The optics are the problem. You made a wager with a local farmer. You put the brand's reputation on a piece of paper, and then you lost. Silence. The company is taking a tax write-off on the unit. It's cheaper than the lawsuit we'd face if we tried to take it back from a public school. But we aren't taking a write-off on you. I understand, Miller said. Pack your desk. Leave the keys to the company car on the blotter. We'll mail your final check. The line went dead. Miller walked to his office. He took his Manager of the Year plaque off the wall. He looked at it. Gold-plated plastic. He threw it into the trash can. It made a hollow, pathetic sound. He walked out the back door. He didn't have a car. He started walking toward the edge of town. 2 miles away, the Peterbilt roared past him. On the back of the trailer, the green JD sat covered in filth, heading toward a classroom where it would be picked apart by boys who grew up on old iron. Miller kept walking. The Italian leather of his boots had cracked. They were ruined, just like everything else. The story didn't end at the dealership. It ended at a small farm 6 miles north. A week later, a reporter from the Omaha World-Herald drove up Earl's gravel driveway. He had a digital recorder and a camera with a lens that cost more than Earl's house. He found Earl in the barn. The barn smelled of gear oil, wood smoke, and history. The Farmall was there. It wasn't cleaned, it wasn't polished. It sat in the center of the floor, a single shaft of light hitting the red hood. Mr. Earl? The reporter asked. I'm here to write the story. The tractor that beat the future. People want to know the specs. They want to know the horsepower. They want to know the secret. Earl was holding a wrench, a heavy steel crescent wrench. He didn't look up. No secret, Earl said. But the torque, the reporter insisted. Our experts say that tractors shouldn't have been able to move that much weight. They say you must have modified the engine. Nitro? Turbocharging? Earl stopped. He turned. He looked at the reporter. Specs don't pull tractors, Earl said. Men do. Men who know their tools. He walked over to the Farmall and patted the fender. This machine was built in 1954. Back then, they didn't build things to be replaced in 5 years. They didn't build things to be controlled by a satellite in space. They built them to be fixed with a hammer and a prayer on a Sunday morning. The reporter started scribbling. So you're saying technology is the enemy? No, Earl said. He sat down on an old wooden crate. Technology is a tool, but when the tool starts owning the man, you've got a problem. That green machine over there? It's got a brain, but it don't have a heart. It don't know what it feels like to be hungry. It don't know what it feels like to have a family depending on the crop. Earl spat into a bucket. It saw the mud and it got scared. It did what the programmers told it to do. It gave up. The reporter took a photo. The flash lit up the dust motes in the air. What about Miller? They say he's working at a hardware store in the next county now, moving boxes. Earl's expression didn't change. Maybe he'll learn the weight of things. Maybe he'll learn that a suit don't make you smart, and a bank account don't make you strong. One last question, the reporter said, closing his notebook. Why the trade school? You could have taken the money. $10,000 is a lot of money for a farm this size. Earl stood up. He walked to the barn door and looked out at his fields. The corn was gold.
The sky was a sharp, clear blue. I don't need $10,000, Earl said. I've got everything I need right here. He pointed to a group of teenagers standing near the fence line at the end of the road. They were looking at his barn. They were looking at the red tractor. "I didn't give that school a tractor," Earl said. "I gave them a reminder. I gave them a piece of the truth." "And what truth is that?" Earl climbed back onto the Farmall. He gripped the iron steering wheel. "The truth that you can't automate character, and you can't download grit." He turned the key. Pop, 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 pop. The engine sang. It was the sound of 1954. It was the sound of steel that refused to die. The reporter watched as Earl drove out into the field. The old man sat tall in the seat. He wasn't looking at a screen. He wasn't checking a GPS. He was looking at the earth. He was feeling the vibration of the engine in his spine. He was in control. The Farmall moved across the horizon, a small red dot against the vast Nebraska sky. It moved slowly. It moved steadily. It moved with the weight of 70 years of being right. Behind it, the world continued to rush. Computers continued to update. Salaries continued to rise and fall. But in that field, time had stopped. The ruts left by the 8R were still there, deep and ugly in the mud. But Earl's tracks ran right over them, straight, deep, permanent. A reminder to anyone who cared to look. The future is fast. The future is bright. The future is shiny. But the past is heavy, and the past doesn't get stuck. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows over the grain bins, the sound of the Farmall echoed off the hills. A steady, rhythmic heartbeat. It was the only sound for miles, the sound of a man, the sound of a machine, and the sound of a lesson that Dawson County would never forget. In the end, Miller lost a job. The school gained a machine. But Earl just kept farming. Because for a man like Earl, the victory wasn't in the pulling. The victory was in knowing that when the world finally breaks down, and it always does, there will still be a red tractor, a black chain, and a man who knows how to use them.